Now, I met Susan, gosh, I think it was about 5 years ago when my biography came out because she was working and still works with Magic Time Literary Publicity. And my friend Kathy Bennett helped me with the publicity for that book. And Susan was going to book festivals and programs and convocations and book clubs and all of that. And and that's when I first met her. But I didn't know she was writing a novel. I knew she was a teacher. She had taught for 33 years. She taught English, and she needs a special award for that. But she was always writing, and she won the South Carolina Fiction Project, the Porter Fleming Literary Competition, the Southern Writers Symposium, and other publications in literary journals. So she is a seasoned writer, but this is her debut novel. And we are delighted to welcome Susan from Spartanburg, South Carolina tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Carolyn. What a lovely introduction. And it has been my pleasure to have met you 5 years ago. And I thank you so much for inviting me to participate in your Women Alone Together programs. What an incredible organization. 20 years. That is fantastic. Fantastic.
Well, I can't believe it's been 20 years, but we're excited about that. But Susan, I thought what we like to do when we start off, we want this to be conversational, but I want you to tell us just a little bit about your personal life, your family, and maybe
Okay.
what you're doing now since you have, quote,
Okay.
retired.
I'll do it. I'll say just a brief introduction about the book, and then I'll tell you all a little bit about, who I am and what I'm doing. My novel, Bells for Eli, I've got it out on the shelf here, is at the heart of this Southern literary novel are first cousins, Ellison, who's called Eli Winfield, and Adeline, who's called Delia Green, and they grow up across the street from each other in the fictitious small town of Green Branch, South Carolina, during the 1960s and early part of the 1970s. And while that's a time that is now decades removed from us in 2021, it is a story for any decade because we all have ordinary circumstances that become extraordinary, and we have to cope with circumstances that are often beyond our control. Witness the pandemic from the last year. After a life altering childhood accident in which Eli drinks Red Devil Lye that has been negligently left in a Coca Cola bottle on the back steps at his house, that accident compromises him physically and it makes him the target of bullying. He's frail. He has strange outer disfigurements like a metal tracheotomy and a white string that comes out of his nose and goes behind his ear and actually pulls a dilator through his esophagus to keep it open. But because of that condition, his cousin Delia becomes his only friend and his defender. And as they age, the cousins' relationship grows into one with deeper, much more complicated feelings. By adolescence, Eli's outer disfigurement is gone, no tubes, no tracheotomy. He appears normal on the outside, and he bolts into adolescence. He is a heartbreaker with a double standard as he guards Delia's vulnerability when she ventures into a destructive romantic relationship. At every turn, Eli assumes the role of her protector. As determined as he is, though, to rescue his beloved cousin, Delia is equally, not only in childhood, but in adolescence, committed to saving Eli when he falls into the wrong crowd enamored with drugs. Their relationship grows into an incomparable love, blossoming into an intimacy that cannot be because they know to love one's cousin is taboo. And in the end, Eli's wounds of the heart from childhood really never leave and are the catalyst for decisions that bring this novel to a pretty staggering conclusion. And Delia discovers a shocking family secret and truths about Eli she has never known. So I've spent the last year during the pandemic, the book coincided with the pandemic, quite literally. The week that the pandemic was declared, my book came out on the press. And I was on tour live for about a week until everything finally shut down. So I learned a great deal about technology in this past year and online events, and it's been wonderful. I mean, it's given me a new way of seeing. At the same time, it's also been difficult not to be able to be face to face with readers. And one thing I've done during the past year is to work on a second novel, which I recently sent to my agent. And I, as Carolyn mentioned, live in Spartanburg, South Carolina, with my husband Wayne. I have two daughters who live in the low country of South Carolina. One's in Summerville and one's in Charleston. And I have four lovely grandchildren. And here at home, I have two lovely and much misbehaved Boston Terriers.
Well, you sound like you're a very busy woman, and you have touched on some of the questions that I'm going to ask, so I may get you to go a little bit deeper into some of the things that you have mentioned. But I have listened to your other interviews, and I know that you got the idea for this book from a family event. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The novel actually is inspired by a very similar accident that I mentioned a few minutes ago to my cousin, first cousin Danny, who drank Red Devil Lye when he, on his second birthday, his father was using the chemical. If you mix it with vinegar, it has the properties of helium, and he was using it to blow up balloons for Danny's birthday and left the bottle somewhere on the house, and he drank it. And obviously he did, like my character Eli, he survived the accident, but his life was much compromised. And I didn't grow up in the town with Danny. He was living in Plainfield, New Jersey when his accident happened, and I was in my small town in Lancaster, South Carolina. But you know, his family visited over the years, and I could see the what he dealt with. And his family did move to Charlotte, North Carolina when we were older. Maybe we were about 11 or 12, something like that. So we got to be good friends. And he dated a good friend of mine, in fact, during our adolescence for a good while. And sometimes he'd set me up on dates. And my husband asked me when he first read the manuscript, and if you read the book, you'll understand about the relationship between Eli and Delia. He said, "What are you going to say if someone asks you if you were ever like in love with your first cousin?" And I say, "Well, I'll have to tell the truth and say no, I was not. But heck, if it makes you buy a book."
Yeah. Well, and it's I know an interviewer asked you one time, why would you write about this taboo subject? But I'm a historian, and you read about that in history. Queen Victoria and her children, and they married their cousins. And in Russia, the young czar had, what was it, hemophilia, and they thought that came about because of intermarriage for so many years. So it has happened in history, and it has gone on. And you can understand how, if people are isolated and they don't have very many choices of who they can court or marry, that
Right,
sometimes these relationships, so you read about it in history all the time, somebody married their cousin.
right, right. And
But now,
yeah, and your biography about Gertrude Thomas is Clanton, isn't it?
yeah, Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas. Good for you, Susan.
Well, I loved that book. But she is an antebellum woman. And sometimes I talk to groups about cousin relationships. And one of the statistics that I learned is that in the planter class of the antebellum South, 12.4% of marriages were between first cousins. And that's a pretty large percentage. And there were a variety of reasons for that. One, as you mentioned, Carolyn, they were fairly isolated on big parcels of land from one another. And they also were fairly inclusive people. They felt more comfortable with people whom they knew, and they also for my research, a father would or an uncle would give a plantation to a son or a nephew if he would marry his first cousin, because that kept all the land and all the property and all the power and the name in the family. So there were a variety of reasons. What is it? Ashley tells Melanie in Gone with the Wind that they're going to marry because they understand each other, that they're alike. So yeah, and you mentioned famous people. I mean, the one that is most ironic to me that I've learned about is Charles Darwin, because he was the father of natural selection, and he was married to his first cousin Emma Wedgwood.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Well, you could probably talk a long time about this.
I've done a lot of stuff. Well, because because of the cousin relationship and because of the mystery that I won't talk about because that would be a spoiler in the story. I started thinking about doing that, and then full disclosure, one of the inspirations for the relationship in the book was when I was studying my own genealogy some years ago to join a historical society. I discovered 8 generations back, someone named Anna DuPont married someone named Gideon DuPont. And I said, oh, isn't that interesting? They had the same last name. And I thought, duh, they were probably kin, and they were first cousins. And that was in the mid 1700s that they married. And so I'm the direct descendant of a first cousin.
Well, and yes, you can go back and find so many examples. And then I guess Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt were cousins, weren't they?
They were. I don't think they were first
I think
cousins,
they were a little bit more removed, second cousins or something.
I think so.
But and it is land very often. I know in the antebellum South, because anything, if a woman had inherited land from her father, a woman could inherit if she were a single woman, but then everything she owned became the man's when they married. So they were always trying to fix up this advantageous marriage because of the land passing. Do you know when the this began to change or people began to frown on it more?
I do. Lewis Henry Morgan, who was an anthropologist, and he was married to his first cousin. He was instrumental, and I can't remember her name right now, but he was instrumental in the 1870s after the war in starting to move to ban first cousin marriages. One of the reasons for that was they had a son, Lemuel, who was born handicapped. Now, they had 2 daughters who were perfectly normal, but his son, Lemuel, was handicapped, and he and his wife withstood a lot of, for lack of a better word, flack, unfounded, with people saying, well, the reason he's like this is because you married. Now, the real, there were no genetics studies back then, but genetically, here's another fun fact that I know from genetics. A couple, now this is not if you intermarry like royals may have done, but a couple who is first cousins and they have offspring, those offspring have between a 1.7 and a 2.8% higher chance of having a child with abnormalities, genetic abnormalities, than normal. And that is like a woman over the age of 35 having a baby. So it's not very much. It was thought to be a lot, in the 1870s. And my suspicion is that happens more when there's a great deal of inner marriage generation.
I guess we have it going way back.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, you've done a lot of research on this topic, and it's so interesting. But I understand that I think you had an editor or an agent that encouraged you to do more research on the actual physical disabilities and how this was treated and all of that to make sure you got it just right, because that was sensitive material to discuss and very medical, right?
Right.
Medical is for loss of another term.
Yeah, absolutely. but, and again, because I would have been too young to know it anyway. And then I'm living many states away from my real life cousin who had the accident and only had a childhood perspective of it. My and I had written what I knew and I had researched it on my own. But my agent did ask me to interview gastroenterologists, and she said more than one. I said, okay. So I interviewed one who was actually probably 80 now or close to it. And so he was practicing in the 60s and he could tell me exactly, why that string was behind the ear, where it was attached. And then I interviewed another gastroenterologist more my age just to think about what we know now about an accident like that we would not have known in the 60s. And one thing I learned is that a child who had an accident like that would be much more prone to cancer. Probably would not live a super long life because of all that damage to the esophagus.
Well, it was just horrific to think about. And I will say this, I've not known of a young person that drank something like that, but I had a friend tell me that her father, who had Alzheimer's,
Oh
and he
my.
was in a home and he drank something accidentally and it actually killed him.
Oh my gosh.
And so you have to be so careful about
You
those
do.
things.
You do.
And I don't know how often it happens, but you always warning your children. I know I was
Right.
always trying to keep things out of their reach. So
Right.
you spoke about something that was very important and very interesting. Now we'll change the subject to a lighter thing. You did a lot with music in this book, and I thought it was delightful. And I've got to admit, I'm a little bit older than this generation. I was maybe 10 years older than these people, but I didn't know all the songs, but I knew a lot of them. But the songs help to define the characters.
They do. They do. And thank you for saying that because I hope that they do. I actually started out life as a music major. So I was, I enjoyed um using some of that musical knowledge and I enjoyed also going back to the music of the 60s and 70s. Eli's favorite songs are Stairway to Heaven and A Whiter Shade of Pale. And I recall quite well the night that I wanted to describe a Stairway to Heaven in the book when Eli and Delia stop in the car after he's taken her to a dance to try to get her distracted from her boyfriend who and he's right is a playboy and is a it's not a good thing for Delia, and in Eli's case it kind of takes one to know one. But I wanted him to put Stairway to Heaven in the 8-track tape in his Camaro, and I wanted to describe it, and I listened to it several times on YouTube, and I had a glass of wine at the time. The more I listened, the more I enjoyed it, and I just, it was just I had the best time going back and listening to describe it.
Well, when you're a teenager, the music of your era is so important to you. And I know back in the 60s, we had Elvis um, um, and it was, I wasn't in a fan club like some of my friends were, but I had girlfriends that were in the Elvis fan clubs and it was just so important in their
It
lives.
was, and I tried to use music too to kind of help define. Eli embraces the counterculture. He's a victim of childhood trauma, and so what he wants to do is never go back to those memories. And one of the things that I've learned that children who do suffer childhood trauma do is they take risks so that adrenaline flows, and they don't have to think and go back. They don't want to feel. They don't want to feel their feelings. And so one of the things Eli does is he embraces the counterculture and falls into the drug culture. That's a huge risk that he takes. And so he is drawn to the music of the Who and
Grateful Dead.
Grateful Dead, exactly. While Delia, though she is independent, she really is more a product of the sort of the times. The times were still pretty insular in the 1960s in the small town South, and I think they were in small towns everywhere. And so a lot of those values and mores of the 1950s were still like you used to see on television on My Three Sons or Leave It to Beaver, were still very much in place. And so she embraces more sort of the easy music of the time. I mean, Three Dog Night is about as heavy as it gets. So I enjoyed kind of using the contrast with music to show the differences with their character.
Mhm. Yes, yes. Well, I picked up on that, and I thought you did a great job with that, and I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Um, and you get into the generational conflicts. Any coming of age novel, you have the mother that's trying to hold the daughter back, but there were so many relationships, Dee and her parents, and Eli and his parents, and Jean was trying to make Eli tough because he was conscious of his difficulties. And then Delia's mother was trying to protect her all the time and almost keep her from growing up, wouldn't let her shave her legs and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And you did a good job describing that. But you felt that tension. And I think that was really an interesting, it was a horrific scene. But when the newcomers to the neighborhood attack Eli, and Delia comes upon it, and she's so upset, and she goes home, and her mother, it was interesting the way her mother responds. Her mother might not have known everything that happened. I don't know exactly how much Delia told her, but the mother started saying to her that you're growing up and things are going to be different now. And then she gave her a Coke, like that makes everything better.
Right,
Give them a Coke in a real bottle.
right.
So,
That's right. Yeah, she does want to protect. I mean, she worries. She knows that Delia is becoming a sexual being, if you will, and she knows this just unconditional love that Delia and Eli have for each other. And then she knows, the new boys in the neighborhood. She's a mother. She knows what's going to happen. But in this, I think I'm so glad you brought up that scene because I think that's an excellent scene. Well, illustration. I don't know how excellent scene is, but I think it's what I hope was a good illustration of Delia's kind of wanting her own autonomy. She doesn't go along with the status quo all the
Steve,
time.
she's frozen up.
Right.
Mm.
She is.
Um,
I think your video might be on pause, Carolyn. So I can until she can come back in, I can talk a little bit more about um, Delia and Eli and their circumstances when they are adolescents. Um, Carolyn mentioned a few minutes ago that an interviewer had asked me why I decided to write about a taboo relationship. And I didn't decide to do that. I decided to look at how an accident that happens to a child very young can change the trajectory both of that child's life and the lives around them. That's what I set out to do. And Delia is deeply affected by what happens to Eli, and it causes her to have this just incredible bond with him in childhood. And so, what do you do when two young people do become sexual beings? Are those feelings that they had for each other in childhood just suddenly going to go away? No, I don't think they are. And I didn't really plan it. I didn't think about it early on, but that same scene I was talking about when I described Stairway to Heaven, when Eli stops the car, he parks the car and he says to Delia, "Do you want to go parking?" And she says, "Don't be ridiculous. Why would we do that?" but he wants to tell her about a sexual indiscretion that he had with a girl so that he can warn her off from Rad, her boyfriend. He doesn't want what happened with him to happen with her. And he stops the car for that purpose. But they've been to this dance. He's had a great deal to drink, and they're sitting in the car, and one thing leads to another. And he tells her he will always love her like crazy and doesn't want anything to happen. And they simply sort of reveal their feelings to each other. And I didn't know it was going to happen. I'm just the conduit. I'm just writing one evening on my computer, and the next morning I read what I wrote, and I said, well, it was inevitable that they were going to have those feelings. And so it was inevitable for me to write it. So I don't know where Carolyn is.
Hey, Susan, this is Steve. We're going to get Carolyn back in.
Okay.
Just if you wouldn't mind, kind of keep going there. We're going to
Okay.
get her back in here.
Is
So, thank you.
I would ask if anybody at this point, Carolyn is asking such fantastic questions, and I'm just so appreciative of her having read the book and all that she knows about it. We were talking about music a few minutes ago, and sometimes I've been asked about the title, Bells for Eli. What do bells have to do with the book? Well, I hope there are some symbolic ramifications of bells in the novel, as well as some literal ones. Bells for Eli, he's a musician. He's a pianist, but what he loves more than anything is percussion, and he is absolutely obsessed with the sound of bells. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that he is a risk taker as an adolescent, and one of the ways that he takes risk is by climbing bell towers. He wants to go up. There are two towers, one behind his grandmother, Mary Margaret Lauderdale's house. It's an old fire tower with a great big bell, and he goes up and rings that. And then he climbs the clock tower that has a carillon of bells in Green Branch because he wants to see them. He wants to know how they work. So quite literally, he loves bells, and that also plays into his risk-taking nature. And I won't give away, because if you read the book, you'll decide yourself what kind of symbolism bells might have. But bells are, I'll just say a couple of things. Bells are said to be the gateway between heaven and earth, and that will certainly factor in the novel. There is some spirituality, a little bit of mysticism in the novel, and there is a lot of talk in the novel about heaven and earth and the connection between heaven and earth. And one other thing I'll mention is that we ring bells as a tribute for people. And I like to think that maybe the title, the novel, it's Delia. She's the first person narrator in this novel. She's the protagonist of the novel. And in a lot of ways, the novel is her tribute to Eli. So let me look in the chat. I think there might be a question there, and I'd be—
Susan, there's one that came in here. It says, how long did it take you to write the book? Also, what is the process for getting an agent?
Oh, goodness. Okay. It took me about a year writing, and I don't advise my writing routine to anybody because I write at night. I think it's just when my inner critic goes to sleep and I can not be distracted by anything. But I probably wrote 4 to 5 nights out of the week for maybe 4 and 5 hour stretches for about a year. And then I was the luckiest woman on earth to get my agent. I know the horror stories of people querying agent after agent after agent, and I was just very lucky. And part of that luck was Carolyn mentioned that I don't do as much work with Magic Time literary publicity as I once did, but I at that time was doing more. And I would often be at a a gathering where there would be authors and then the occasional agent. So I had actually met my agent at an event. Now, I didn't think in any way, shape, or form she would remember me. Why would she? I mean, she talks to me for, less than 20 seconds. It's just one of those polite, how are you? I'm still not convinced that she remembered me, but she was my number one top choice. And I went on her website and it said, does not take new clients. And I said, well, there's no point in my writing a query letter. I'll just step outside the box. Again, I'm not sure I should be advising anybody to do it, but it's what I did. I simply picked up the phone on a Friday afternoon and I called her office in New York. And a woman picked up the phone. I announced who I am. I asked to speak to Marley. And the lady said, hold on. Well, then I did start to panic because I thought, oh my gosh, she's actually going to come to the phone. And she did. And I said, oh, I don't know if you remember me, blah, 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 blah. But I have a manuscript and I wonder if you'd be willing to read it. And there was dead silence. And I figured she had hung up. And then, a few seconds later, she said, okay, you can send it to me. I hope I'll love it. Click. She hung up. And early the next week, I can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday, I got an email from her. And she said, I do love the novel. And that was how I got my agent, which is very, very unusual. I did not have an easy a time with her placing the book. It took a while. The the environment for books now, the big houses in New York, they don't want to take a chance unless they think they can sell a couple of 100,000 copies, and they are looking for great big, dramatic, over the top, Gone Girl kind of books from debut authors. And my novel is a Southern novel set in the 60s and 70s. But eventually we did find the right home for Bells for Eli. And I'm very happy about that.
Susan, thanks for sharing that story. We've got Carolyn now. We're just going to have her audio for the rest of this, but
Okay.
Carolyn, you want to pick it up from here?
Well, I don't know what has been said. I apologize for it because what happened. And my husband is helping me, and my computer has, we think it's the internet connection in our building, which is weak sometimes, but it always holds up and comes back on. But tonight, I apologize for it. We're going to have to try to make an adjustment. But I did hear what Susan was saying about getting an agent. And I know that you ended up working with Mercer University Press, which I thought we could give them a plug.
Yes.
Because I also work with Mercer, and they did a beautiful job with Susan's book, and she has a beautiful cover. She can hold it up there for you. And how did they end up coming up with that cover?
I think it's a beautiful cover too. And I think the cover of your book is beautiful. I think Mercer makes about as beautiful a book as any I see anywhere. They asked me if I had any ideas for the cover and quickly said, we're not necessarily going to take it, but you're welcome to give your input. So I said, well, the only idea I had was the house called Magnolia Manor in the book that is Eli's aristocratic grandmother's antebellum home. I call it Magnolia Manor, but the model for that home is actually my great grandparents' house outside in the country in Lancaster. And in the beginning, when I was writing the book and I knew I needed an old home and Eli's grandmother was going to be from an old family, I started researching various Southern antebellum homes, and I was spending a lot of time, and I thought, well, dadgum, I know one. I've got it in my head. I know every nook and cranny. I think I'll just use that as my model. So I actually sent some photographs of the house. I went to Lancaster. I took some. The young man who does my website and did my book trailer, he took some photographs, and I sent them to Mercer, and they have this phenomenal couple who are graphic artists, and they took the picture I'd sent, which was actually of the front of the house, and there were some flowers blooming, and they artistically rendered it, which just I think they did a magnificent job. And then the back, you probably can't see it online, but there's some, it's the top of it's magnolia leaves, in a magnolia tree, because the house is called Magnolia Manor. It's not called that. It's not called anything in real life, but I call it that in the book.
Susan, we have a really great question coming in chat. Says, can you tell us more about your inspiration for Mimi's lovely home?
Well, yeah, Mimi's lovely home is based on the model that I was just saying of my great grandparents' home. My paternal great grandparents, the house sits outside of Lancaster, South Carolina, and it was built, I think, in about 1832. And my family acquired it really right after the war. I think my great grandfather was a farmer, and so he acquired the land and the home and farmed it. So that was the model for it. But there, in real life, there is an old fire tower outside behind that house that when I and my brother and all of my cousins, we used to go out to that house all the time, because there were 10 children in my grandfather's generation, and 2 sisters remained in the house who did not marry. They took care of the house, and so we would all gather out there and go, and we would climb that tower all the time as children, and it's amazing. Sometimes an adult would say, that tower's been there a long time, it might fall or whatever, and it never happened.
That is fascinating. Steve, if she can hear me now, I wanted her to talk about how she started out writing this book. Does she use an outline, or did she use an outline all the way through, and what happened? That's an interesting story.
I was a teacher. We were teachers, Carolyn, and so teachers by nature are planners. And or at least I think most of them are. And I started out thinking, okay, I've got this by the tail. I'm going to plan every chapter, and I'm going to know exactly where I'm going to go. After the 3rd chapter, I never looked at it again, because it's just like people say, the characters, once they came alive, they were in charge, and I was just moving along with them. I mean, I knew some things that I wanted to happen in the novel. I knew how the novel was going to start, and I knew what the penultimate chapter was going to be, but I did not know what that vast middle would be. And as I say, I planned out all these chapters, and I don't even know where that outline is. I never looked at it again, and I just kind of let things happen. As they would.
Well, do you bond with your characters, and do they become real to you, stay with you?
Yeah, they very much became real human beings in my head. They really did. And the hardest character for me to write was Gene, Eli's father, whom Delia calls him Uncle Gene. He's her blood uncle. Delia's from 1st generation college parents, and her uncle has married way above his station, as people used to say. And that gives him some, he's not as confident, maybe as he could be, and he's alcoholic, and he has a whole lot of guilt for what has happened to Eli, because he is directly responsible. He's the one that left the chemical in the bottle. And I didn't like him. I mean, here I created this character, and I did not like him. And I had a really hard time, because we need to have sympathy for him. He's not a minor walk-on character. He's important in the story, and therefore he couldn't be a flat character. Nobody is all bad or all good, and it was really hard for me to feel sympathy for him. But finally, when I wrote the chapter, when their children, they're walking out of school, and it's Halloween, and Delia and Eli often walk home together from school, and Gene has been he desperately wants his son to be like other boys. And he no matter how dysfunctional, how wrong-minded he is, he wants his son to be a man. And he wants him to be able to stand up. And this is before Eli, this is when he still has the trach and the string and the tube in his stomach. And he is still very much bullied. And Gene has been hiding off behind the baseball field. And when Delia and Eli come out of school and these boys start taunting him and calling him a freak and saying he doesn't need a Halloween costume, Gene bursts onto the scene. He's drunk and he has an axe handle. And what ends up happening in that scene is he doesn't mean to, but he breaks one of those boys' kneecaps. And when I finished that scene, I could feel Gene's humanity. I felt for him. He loved his son, and no matter in what dysfunctional way, he loved him, and he wanted the best for him, even if it was not what we might think it would be any kind of way to go about it. So I was able to see him fully as a human being at that point. But yes, the characters really did live with me, and they are pretty much just out of my imagination. The one character who is most like someone from life that I've known is Delia's father. Her father, Will, is he has a lot of characteristics that my own father had. Anything else? Are you still there, Carolyn?
Yep. Katie, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you just
Oh, good,
fine.
good, good.
Yes.
Yes, I'm still here. And again, I apologize to everybody, but Susan, you are doing a fabulous job. And you're a very good talker. And so you can just have the stage. And I was going to ask you, what is the hardest thing about writing a novel? You wrote short stories and short essays for so long. And this
Yes.
is your first novel. What was the hardest thing for you?
I think pacing can be hard. I don't know if it's the hardest thing, but I got, I wrote a lot of childhood scenes, and, I enjoyed writing them. But as my agent pointed out, there's not enough to keep us going. And that was one of the big things I did with revision, was to go back and cut some of those scenes and add some more dramatic moments in those scenes. So I think I'm always really aware of pacing right now. And I always have a little bit of a nervousness when I get toward the end, or I think I'm getting toward the end of a chapter, whether in this book, whether it was this book or the one that I just turned in to my agent, as in, how do I know that I've come to the end of this moment and I need to transition into the next moment? And I started thinking about this. I don't know if this metaphor makes sense, but this is what I've come up with. I started thinking about the chapters in a novel being kind of like waves in the ocean. The ocean is one big body of water. So, okay, my novel is one big body of material, but waves are different sizes and they come in at different rates. And you might have a great big wave, and then you might have a couple of little waves that follow it or that precede it. And that was something too my main reader would say to me, and something that I had to really work on in Bells for Eli. If you don't want too many quiet chapters, by the same token, you don't want too many huge dramatic chapters where things happen, because you'll wear out your reader. And if you have too many quiet chapters, you'll bore your reader. So I try to think about the undulation of chapters. They've all got to rise, and that's something I had to become aware of, that every chapter is it's not a short story by any means, but it does have its own center. Each chapter has its own center, and it has to rise to its own peak, and then it's got to kind of come to not a conclusion, but it's got to roll in, kind of like the wave does. That wave doesn't conclude by any means, but it rolls in. So I think I had a lot, I mean, I practiced and I worked hard at trying to pace and trying to kind of mix huge, I don't mean long, I mean big happenings in a chapter with quieter things that follow, or vice versa. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I have heard Martha Hall Kelly, when she talked to us about Lilac Girls,
Uh-huh.
she was in person with us. And I don't know if you've read that book, but she has 3
I
points
have
of
read it.
view. And one was this doctor that operated on these women, the rabbits,
Yes.
in concentration camps. And she
Yes.
was the Jean character, the real hard character to write about. And Martha Hall said that it was so hard to write about her because she was the evil, the antagonist. And she said her son would come home from school and he said, "Mom, I know who you've been writing about today."
Wow.
Because
Wow.
it changed her personality. I mean, she just got so frustrated. But I think that you have, if you have chapters with real tension, things that are hard to talk about, like the horrific scene with the bullies, then you have to let up and have a lighter scene just to give your readers a break.
You do.
Because you can't keep that intensity up the whole
That's
time.
right. That's
and I
right.
think that's what Martha Hall was talking about.
Right. And that's what my little self-made, metaphor with the ocean is like, is my reminder that some things have to be smaller, waves have to be smaller. They can't all be crashing, surfable kind of waves. That's exactly right. Now, the hardest thing for me to do in writing Bells for Eli actually came after the original manuscript, because one of the things my agent asked me to do was to come up with something other than the bond from the accident. Like, I thought that was enough of a bond, but she said she thought I needed to develop something. Something needed to happen that only Eli and Delia would know. And it had to be something that would bring them together in a way that they could never be separated from it. And so I said, well, that's not much of an order. Gee, let me just see what I can do here. And I squirmed and I worried. And finally, this is the truth. I wasn't here in Spartanburg where we have hills. I was down in Beaufort where it's flat. And I literally rode my bicycle for 15 miles. And when I got back, I had, as we might say, thunk up an idea. And I rushed into the house and started just writing down ideas very quickly on the computer before they left me, because it was, and what it ended up being was the whole mystery subplot in the novel. There's a whole subplot of mystery that comes together in the end with Delia's and Eli's story. And I won't say much about it because it would be a spoiler. But
I think you did a great job of that, because you are surprised at the end. I think a lot of our women will have read the book, but some may not have. But I reread it last week because we were going to be discussing it. I'd read it some months ago when you sent it to me, and then I reread it again. And I love to do that. If it's a good book, you pick up on things and you really see, I see the subplots in that stream that was going the whole time. But, who's Francie that shows up?
Yeah, it all starts with
Francie. All that story was so powerful, and you did a good job of bringing that.
I appreciate it. And my agent was exactly right, because I wasn't dissatisfied at all with my ending that I had, which is in the original manuscript. But I don't know that I ever felt like it was perfect. And once that mystery gets resolved in the end and comes together with what was in the original story that happens in the end, I think Delia's epiphany, or her understanding, it just happened really, you know, powerfully, or just like it was supposed to happen. So as much work as it was for me to weave that subplot into the novel, it was the exact right thing to do.
Well, it was wonderful, and I agree with you. One of my questions was, did you ever disagree with an editor?
Oh
And
yeah. Oh yes.
you think they're wrong, and sometimes you can take somebody on and try to convince them, but it sounds like in this case you did the work and
Yeah.
feel like that they did
Yeah.
make the right suggestion.
Well, and I think, you know, in my case, I mean, I'm not sure that a lot of young agents really kind of almost act like editors. But in my case, Marley, who's a little older than I am, she's old school, and she was a great editor. I mean, she's the one who suggested that subplot. I mean, she didn't suggest the content of it. She simply said I needed something more to bring Eli and Delia together in a way they could never be separated. And she was, you know, really helped me in that regard. And as I mentioned, I've turned in my second manuscript to her, and she's read it, and she called me last week, and she had hired someone to read it to give her feedback. And I have a list. I got a list of things that she wants me to address. That's not as big, thank goodness, as a subplot, but and I will do that. You know, I will address that. There are a couple of things on that list that I might not be in full agreement with, and we'll talk about them. But I'm grateful. If this is what I believe about being a writer, all all successful writing is about rewriting, and you have to be willing to do that. And you have, we cannot, I cannot, and I don't think most writers can see everything about their own work objectively. We just can't. We're too close to it. And one of the greatest gifts in the world is a good reader, um, and people who can offer feedback and advice. My main reader, who went really chapter by chapter with me, and has done it with the second novel, as a poet. His name is Peter Schmidt, and he teaches at the University of Miami. And he kind of took me on as a project, I think. It's too long a story to go into how we're friends, but I remember I had written a tower scene in Bells for Eli that I just loved. And I loved it. It was a big risk-taking chapter. And I sent it, and he sent back an email that said, nope, redundant. You've covered this ground. I was so mad, I didn't know what to do. I mean, I had spent so much time on that chapter. I called him up and I said, what do you mean it's redundant? He said, just don't need it. He said, I just think that you can do something else. So I got rid of the chapter. I did something else.
Well, it worked out. I think you did a great job with this novel. And so your second one, you've gotten the first draft in, and um, you're working away on that. That sounds like you're on your way.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm working on revisions now, and it you mentioned the 3 points of view in Lilac Girls, and this novel has 3 points of view, and I really was terrified of trying it, but I couldn't see any other way to write this novel. But it actually did not end up being, at least, I mean, I don't know, because maybe nobody will ever like the book, but as far as writing it, it didn't end up being as difficult as I thought it would be.
well, it sounds like you're well on your way, and you've done another good job. Just quickly, tell us who your favorite writers are.
Oh my. Well, I'm because I'm a Southerner and I'm a Southern writer. I'm quite partial to Southern writers. The four When I was a sophomore in college, I was a music major, and I took an elective course in Southern Lit, and we studied four female writers from the mid 20th century. We studied Flannery O'Connor, Catherine Ann Porter, Eudora Welty, and Carson McCullers. And I think of those women, and those are the only four writers we studied in the course. And those women writings, I think, I fell in love. I absolutely fell in love. And all of those women's writings, I think, have deeply influenced me. Um, Modern writers whom I like, I've read, I'm attracted to domestic situations. So I've read most of Ann Tyler's novels. She's sort of Southern. She lives in Baltimore, Maryland. I guess we would consider her a Southern writer. I've lately enjoyed the novels of Wiley Cash. It's kind of that, they call it that grit Southern lit. Um, I've just finished, um, and this is not a Southern novel, but I've just finished Writers and Lovers by Lily King. I like Lily King's work a whole lot. And that novel was particularly spoke to me because the protagonist is a novelist, and you go through her trials and tribulations with her. And I enjoyed that work a lot. Um, I've just finished reading The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, the story of two light-skinned African-American women. One remains African-American and one passes as white, and their stories and how different they are, these twins. That's a fascinating novel. Um, who else? Other Southern writers I love: Peter Taylor, Tennessee Williams. Um, who else? Southern Ernest Gaines. So there's
Well,
some.
I can tell that you've been a teacher because you have read so much and loved all these writers. And I will tell you that when I was at Agnes Scott, my freshman year, I sat at a table across from Flannery O'Connor.
Oh
And
my gosh, Carolyn.
The table.
I already admire you and look up to you, but when we see each other again, I just want to touch you. Wow.
I mean, I was a freshman in college and I was so intimidated, and I don't think I said very much, but it was a wonderful opportunity. And of course, and my daughter did her doctoral dissertation on Catherine M. Porter.
Oh
and
my.
so those writers I've heard of a lot and talked about a lot in the family.
Wow.
And so it just sounds like you're doing wonderful things, and your book is very memorable. And what is that quote, the Fitzgerald to Hemingway, the purpose of fiction?
Yeah, there's two other writers that I have love and have been influenced by is F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. And if you all have not seen, folks out there, if you have not seen Ken Burns' three-part series on Ernest Hemingway on PBS, try to catch it when it comes back on. It's really, really good. But in a letter to his friend Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald said that the purpose of a work of fiction, and I can't quote it, I'm paraphrasing here, but is for the characters to resonate in the reader's mind. And so if my characters, if their circumstances resonate after a reader finishes the book, then I like to think that was really good, because that's what I think. Things resonate with you.
Well, I think the purpose of fiction is to appeal to lingering effect on readers' mind, and I think your book will have a lingering effect on my mind and many of our women too. And I really appreciate your sharing with us tonight. Steve, look at the chat and see if there's anything else on the chat list that we have not answered.
Yes, there is one here. It says, can you talk about the relationship between Eli's parents and between his mother and grandmother?
Okay. Eli's parents, as I mentioned a while ago, Gene really marries above his station. But he and Mary Lily, his wife, Eli's mother, were high school sweethearts. And Mary Lily is from an aristocratic family. Her parents did not want her to marry Gene. But he went off to World War II. He came back a hero. And they sent her off to Juilliard, thinking if they got her off to that fine music school, and she would forget about Jean, but she didn't. She came home and they ended up eloping one night. They just left and they eloped. And so the relationship between Mary Lily and her mother, Mary Margaret, who lives out at Magnolia Manor, is strained, to some degree. I mean, they don't dislike each other, they communicate, but there are places in the book where they have the opportunity, to talk and to be together. And Mary Lily always finds a reason to leave quickly and to not stick around and get too deep into conversation with her mother. And one of the reasons for that is that her marriage to Jean. And yet Mary Margaret, I mean, there's never anywhere in the book where anything untoward or unpleasant happens between her and her son-in-law. And certainly Mary Margaret adores Delia, who is Jean and Jeanette. I mean, Jean's niece, his blood niece. So, and she absolutely adores Delia and looks at Delia really almost as her own grandchild. They spend a lot of time, Delia and Eli do, out at Magnolia Manor. Spend a lot of time. Did I answer the whole question? Might have forgotten half.
And I would just add to that Eli's mother, Mary Lily, right? She makes excuses. She's an enabler almost of Jean.
She is.
And she accepts him. She never talks about divorce or anything. And she acts like she doesn't see things. But she had to see a lot
Yes.
that he was doing.
Yes.
But the whole trauma of having Eli and all of the things that they went through together,
Right.
I can see how that would bond them too. Their suffering and their anguish for their son.
Right.
So
Right.
it was a complex relationship. And back in those days, you just didn't get a divorce like you
No.
get divorces today.
No.
Divorce was rare.
Small town South during that era, people were trying to live up to a certain sort of American dream standard, back to the Leave It to Beaver world. I mean, people are human. Of course they have flaws, and of course things are never perfect, but people tried to make things seem okay and would sweep things under the rug. People didn't go to counseling. At one point in the book, Jean's sister, Jeanette, Delia's mother, asks him, should you maybe go talk to somebody at the church or whatever? And he just flies off the handle. No, he's not going to do that.
Yep. That was unbelievable. That's the way a lot of people were back at that time.
Exactly. My own mother had a really good friend, and she had an alcoholic husband, and it was bad. And at one point, her friend, talked about leaving her husband. And both of my parents thought that was the right thing to do. And her friend had a college education. She could have made her way in the world, but in the end, she did not. She did not leave him. And she thought it would be too embarrassing. And she told my mother she had no idea what she would do. That's the way it was.
I know a situation similar to that, of that time period. Well, this has been great, and I just thank everybody. I thank you, Susan. You have done a fabulous job of